The progress that you have allowed Chris and others to make in the issue of human trafficking has been profound and has saved lives and saved the very souls of young women who were vulnerable to trafficking. We've educated governments. We've called attention when we've needed to. We've educated airlines and other forms of transportation, all of whom have made a great contribution. And also, this is an issue which is unified. There's so many things that we feel we've had to discuss this week and previously are areas where necessarily we have to agree and call things out when they need to. But this is an area in which really all 50-something countries participating this week can agree to. Specifically, Chris will deal in his own fashion, but I think he wants to talk about vulnerable persons, school-age persons, and persons in the education system, and ways that we can make further gains in that respect. So, Chris, our hats are off to you for your dogged persistence in making this issue visible and achieving success. So, Chris Smith.
Thank you very much, Senator Wicker, and Chairman of our delegation. And I want to thank him for his leadership. It's been extraordinary. Can you hear me okay? I want to thank my good friend and colleague, Senator Wicker, for his leadership. He's the head of our United States delegation and a great supporter of human rights and a very, very fierce opponent of human trafficking and has done so much in that regard. So I want to thank him for his leadership. Thank all of you for being here. As I think many of you know, I'm the special representative for human trafficking for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I got involved, I've been in Congress since 1981, have worked on human rights my entirety of my career, but got involved in trafficking in 1995. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, we began to realize that many people, and because of the internet and unfortunately a false sense of entitlement, the buying and selling, the commodification of women began to explode. Maybe even before that, but certainly around that year. In the year 2000, I wrote our landmark law. It's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TPVA of 2000. It's a whole-of-government approach, and behind it is the idea that every agency of government needs to be pulling on the same oar, pushing, striving, and unceasingly to combat this terrible evil. We emphasize, as you do in your respective parliaments, the 3 Ps: prevention, prosecution of the traffickers, and protection of the victims. And we've had some success. Every year we put out a tip report. I have some copies for you if you would like. And it came out of our original law. But about a year and a half ago, my good friend, Kenneth Morris, contacted us and said, you know, we need to be doing much more in the area of prevention. There's not enough. Yeah, we're putting people behind bars, shelters are being created, but we're not going at the source. We're not preventing the way we could if we were really all in with regards to that. So we put together a bill called the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Prevention and Protection Act of 2018 with tremendous insights from Kenneth. And the first title is all about providing grants for age-specific, age-appropriate, so that we have curriculum throughout the entirety of the United States of America, so that in elementary school, secondary school, and then after that, there's prevention strategies so that, especially with the use of the internet, which has become very, very, it has unfortunately caused so many young people, particularly young girls, to be ensnared in this terrible human trafficking. So it's a comprehensive approach. We now have a brand new, pursuant to the new Frederick Douglass Act, National Strategy on Prevention. And in fullness, we have some background on it for you. It will be released very shortly, and it's all about empowering our school-age children to know the signs and then to take proactive action and have the teachers trained as well. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have three outstanding people who are leaders in the field, starting with Kenneth Morris. And Kenneth, amazingly, is the great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, one of the greatest and most respected abolitionists who helped stop the slave trade and slavery itself in the United States. I read one of his autobiography. I was awed by its comprehensiveness and how this man, against all odds, he was a slave until the age of 20, and he is such a prolific writer, and he made the difference in the United States. Well, we have his great-great-grandson right here, who is continuing to fight against modern-day slavery, and added to that, Booker T. Washington is also in his ancestral line. He's the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. So here's a man who has a legacy that is second to none, and we're so grateful to have him here. And his foundation, the initiatives, is doing yeoman's work. So in many ways, I hope you will benefit and avail yourself of best practices already written, already put together. Then we'll hear from Philip. I don't know him, but I know him as of today. Philip Hyldgaard, I know him by reputation, from A21, and they have done, he has done amazing work on sheltering, on crisis shelters, including one back in 2008, and then they did one in Greece. They work in Bulgaria, Greece, Ukraine, South Africa, and Thailand. He was recognized by the U.S. Department of State as a hero back in 2012. Every year, people who are really making a difference in combating human trafficking are saved by the Secretary of State for that honor, and this man received that honor. And they have a great curriculum, which you'll hear about, in an effort to try to mitigate and end this horrible practice and the exploitation of our kids. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Kenneth Morris.
Congressman Smith, it's my honor to be here with you this afternoon. When we started talking about working on the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act, I knew that the Congressman was a big fan of Frederick Douglass, and so I thought that it would be an easy ask. And so I thank you very much for having me here today. You know, you introduced me as the great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. I'm actually the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. It's a lot of greats. And the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to these great American heroes, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know a grandparent, and some of you may had known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 95, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap as she would tell me what it was like to know what she would call him the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And several years ago, I was with a group of students, and they were looking at me cross-eyed like, man, you are so far removed, and what does all of this history have to do with our lives today? And I was trying to give them some context to how close the generations are, and I had this profound thought that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man. I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in the United States and many parts of the world. And so who is Frederick Douglass? He was born into slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland. He taught himself to read and write over the objections of his overseers. He escaped at the age of 20, as you heard, and then he went on to become a leading abolitionist and a leading voice in the fight against slavery in the United States. He published the North Star newspaper out of Rochester, New York. He was an advisor to presidents, particularly Abraham Lincoln. And so later in life, when people would see Frederick Douglass, who was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American recorder of deeds for the District of Columbia, and the list goes on and on and on. And people would say, Frederick, I need to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education? And having never spent one day of his life in a classroom because it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write, he would respond on occasion by saying, my degree is written on my back. My degree is written on my back. And so I want to start really with an important story in Frederick Douglass's life while enslaved, because it really is at the foundation of our human trafficking prevention, education, work in schools. And that was while he was enslaved on the eastern shore of Maryland at around 8 or 9 years old, he was moved to Baltimore to become the house servant for his master's brother-in-law. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't around people that could teach him how to read and write, and he was going to be in the big city where he would be around free black children that could assist and poor white children. What happened most importantly when he got there was his slave mistress had never had a slave before, and she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him. She just saw this bright little boy who was eager to learn, and so she began to teach young Frederick his ABCs. But when his master found out about it, he got angry, and he forbade the lessons, and he looked at his wife and he looked at Frederick and he said, you cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. And Frederick looked at his master and he heard that message and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power, and education equals liberation, education equals emancipation, education equals freedom. And so through our work, we always ask the question, what would Frederick Douglass do if he were here today? How could we unfit communities to allow slavery to thrive and exist through education, with young people being the starting point? And for young people at one end of the spectrum, they're the most vulnerable to being exploited, but at the other end of the spectrum, they can be the most empowered to affect change around an issue like this. Also, teachers in classrooms are frontline defenders, and they can be frontline interveners. So we turn to schools, and Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So if you're looking at issues of demand for sex trafficking, if we can get to young boys at an age when they're forming their character and their identity and who they're going to become, and teach them that their actions and their choices that they make as young adults and men can feed into the demand side. This is a short-term solution because we're reducing the vulnerability of young people to being trafficked, but also it's a long-term solution because we're building strong children. We're building modern-day abolitionists in the mold of Frederick Douglass. So what I want to talk to you about this afternoon is a project that we initiated in California 3 years ago called Protect, and it's prevention organized to educate children on trafficking. It's a project that we started with two California-based nonprofits, Three Strands Global and Love Never Fails. We partnered with the California Department of Education and also the California Attorney General's Office, and our research evaluators, the Institute for Social Research of Sacramento. The mission is reduce the vulnerability of children by identifying and preventing human trafficking using a standardized trauma-informed education curriculum and systematic delivery methodology. So what is human trafficking? It's defined as modern slavery, and human trafficking are umbrella terms for the act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for compelled labor or commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Children who are exploited are often referred to as commercially sexually exploited children, or CSEC. Now, does it happen here? This map represents the calls made to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, also referred to as Polaris, about suspected human trafficking cases throughout the United States. Since the hotline began in 2012, California has had the most reported cases every year. Between 2017 and 2018, you can see that the growing rates of suspected exploitation that's being reported. Now, we talked about knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. So education is important. So why are we addressing this topic in schools? While victims are diverse in terms of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, education, gender, and citizenship status, most victims share the trait of vulnerability. We all go through the experiences that could make us vulnerable to people taking advantage of us. Sadly, the U.S. Department of Justice has reported that the average age for forced entrance into street prostitution is 12 to 14 years old for girls and 11 to 13 for boys. These children are being exploited. That's why it's incredibly important for students to have the opportunity to learn about this issue in school. The more we know, the better we can protect ourselves from exploitation. Now, when we first started talking to Congressman Smith's office, we found that we were defining two terms or two words differently. Prevention. The prevention that we're talking about is primary prevention. Preventing the victimization in the first place. And what had been done through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and the very good work by many organizations was a kind of a secondary and tertiary prevention, preventing further victimization. How do we train first responders and other people to identify victims earlier so we can prevent the further victimization? The other word that we were defining differently was education. Typically, in the landscape of anti-trafficking work, education is defined as educating the public on the existence of human trafficking. And what we were talking about was education in the classroom, institutionalized knowledge that is ongoing. Also, when we looked to start doing this work in 2007, I thought about the legacy of Frederick Douglass as a great abolitionist and Booker T. Washington as a great educator and founder of Tuskegee Institute Normal School in 1881 in Tuskegee, Alabama. How do we combine those legacies, abolition through education? And so the definition of the terms is very important, but when we were looking at the landscape of how human trafficking was being addressed in the United States and internationally, we thought that there was a little bit of a flaw in that first TVPA because it only addressed what happened after the victimization occurred. Law enforcement would come in and arrest and prosecute. Victims would be rescued, restored, and rehabilitated. And while we're talking about something that's very important because it is about a human life, and we as human beings tend to act with an abundance of heart first, and when we see a child in trouble, the first thing we want to do is we want to rescue them. But if we're only rescuing, restoring, rehabilitating, we're creating this cycle of exploitation that just churns on, and as well-meaning as we are we complicit in allowing this to continue on? I like to use analogies, and I don't know if you all remember the British petroleum oil spill that happened in the United States in the Gulf of Mexico. And we, as people with heart, we saw the oil on the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, and it was damaging local industry, and it was on the wildlife, and the first thing that we want to do is we want to rush down and clean up that oil that we can see on the surface. But what British Petroleum did to their credit was they put a camera at the bottom of the ocean and they showed the world what the priority was. And the priority was capping that well that was spewing millions of gallons of crude into the Gulf of Mexico. Had that not been the priority, we would still be out there in disaster relief mode trying to clean up this mess. And I think this is how we've approached human trafficking work, is constantly in disaster relief mode, trying to clean up the mess on the surface. And unfortunately, we can't put a camera into the bedrooms of young girls and boys that are being preyed upon through social media and technology to show what's going on. So what education is, it caps the well of this particular disaster. So recent laws. In 2017, California Governor Brown signed a bill called the Human Trafficking Prevention, Education, and Training Act that made California the first state in the nation to require that educators and students both learn about human trafficking prevention. The following year, the governor signed AB 1861, adding an additional piece to AB 1227. Now, the information related to human trafficking must also include information about how social media and mobile device applications are used for human trafficking. Unfortunately, this issue is becoming more prominent in all areas due to technology usage, gaming, and social media in particular. Through human trafficking prevention education, we can provide students the knowledge and tools that they need to stay safe online and in person. It's imperative that parents also are learning about what this crime really is and how to prevent it. That is why SB 11-4 was signed in 2018 and will be effective in 2020. We would like to see federal legislation in the same area of what we've been able to do successfully in California. And so our project and what we're doing, so human trafficking vulnerabilities, traffickers often learn and exploit the victim's vulnerabilities. You can see on the screen some of those children that are vulnerable: homeless youth, foster youth, runaway youth. Our program in California has really 4 components to it: protocol, training, curriculum, and then the rollout in communities. And what we're doing with protocol, in 2012, Mayor Bloomberg in New York asked us to come and work with New York City Public Schools to develop a curriculum, a prevention education curriculum. But what we found when we got there was that stakeholders in the communities, the service providers, law enforcement, education, were not working in coordination around this issue, and there was no protocol for responding to a disclosure in the classroom if a student has the courage to say that they're in trouble or somebody that they know is in trouble. And so what protocol does is it creates a trafficking-free community where you see coordinated community stakeholders, training and response protocol being directed at educators. Educators are being trained on how to deliver curriculum in the classroom, and then the human trafficking education is going to the students, and then you see that they take action through social service and civic engagement. There's awareness and there's prevention. A community that's not trafficking free, what you see on the right side of the screen would be everything pointing back at the students, traffickers pointing back at the students. So the protocol is really important, and it's the first thing that we do when we go into community is do an assessment on what the organizations there are already doing and if there is a response mechanism in place. The training that we offer is online. The California Department of Education tasks us to reach more than 300,000 educators and more than 6.2 million students. And so this was something that we needed to design that can be scaled up and that we can deliver it in a way that we'll be able to get the information to them online. And so what the educators do is they have 3 modules that they have to go through: a Human Trafficking 101 education module, 102, which is trauma-informed services, and then 103, community engagement. And we just added a 104 module, which is specifically for parents and teaching them about this issue and how they can be proactive in protecting their children from being exploited online. California Department of Education asked us to line this up with state standards. We already know that teachers are overburdened in the classroom, and so we needed to give them something that would align with what they're already teaching in the classroom so that it becomes an added resource, tools that they can pull in to the classroom. So what we have to do in California is we start in the 5th grade, and as we heard, the average age for entry is 11, 12, and 13. So we actually need to be younger than the 5th grade, but it's not a conversation about sex trafficking or labor trafficking in the 5th grade. It's about safe people, safe places, safe spaces. And then it continues in the 7th grade, protecting a masterpiece. And then the 9th grade, it's where the bulk of the training and information comes in, understanding and recognizing human trafficking. And then the 11th grade, it's typically in a history class or a class where they can begin to become modern-day abolitionists. Now that they've had the 3 previous years of education, the question that we always got from students is, how can we do something about this? How can we use our passion, our talent, our intellect, and our creativity to go into the community and to raise awareness? This is just a screenshot of what it looks like online. There are lots of resources, there are videos, there are experts that are providing information, and then it's also creating a community with teachers across county lines. So far, we're in 30+ counties in California. We just expanded into 2 counties in Utah, 1 county in Nevada, and 1 in Texas. And so we see this as a national model that, again, we can scale up and bring this information across the country. I just wanted to play this short video for you so you can hear from a teacher on how this is impacting her and her students. quickly just go through the 104 module excerpts for parents, and this is to meet the AB 1861 requirements for 2020, that legislation that I mentioned previously. And so, did you know that traffickers often use social media and live gaming apps to connect with vulnerable youth, according to the New York Post? In a tech article released in April 2018, the New York Post stated, quote, "The rise of social media has been a boon for sex traffickers, making it easier than ever for pimps to target, groom, and sell your children," top law enforcement officials say, end quote. And these predators are watching, and they're listening, they're friending, they're seeing. Oh, she's not happy with school. Oh, he's upset against his parents. Oh, he has issues with his sexuality, or she is having problems with her friends, says Inspector Jim Klein, commander of the NYPD's Vice Enforcement Unit. What this article is describing is the role that vulnerability plays for predators, like we just discussed in section 1. When vulnerability is combined with technology usage, especially social media, it doesn't matter where we live, we are connecting and sharing information about ourselves with people all over the globe. We and our children are on different forms of technology throughout every day. Common Sense Media released these estimates in 2015 for teenagers. In this study, the average media usage every day was 9 hours. That's a lot of time, and it can be for educational reasons, social, personal, but many times they may be engaging with people that they have not met before, gaming and social media in particular. When playing a game, it's often more about having fun with who you're playing with than actually having met the person before in real life. When we look at social media, those that are our friends, our so-called our followers, what and who are they following? Again, this is a module for parents. This is directed at parents. Most social media websites and apps require that kids be 13 to sign up. Despite what many think, this isn't to limit kids' exposure to inappropriate content, but because of the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which prevents companies from collecting certain information from kids under 13. Rather than create an environment that protects kids from data tracking, Facebook and other websites and apps choose to restrict access to those under 13. This slide, by no means, is an exhaustive list, but it does a good job of highlighting the other main online platforms where users are able to connect and share their life experiences, vulnerabilities with others. There are millions of users on YouTube and Musically that can view others' music and video streaming. The purpose of these apps is to create an interactive environment for music lovers, but unfortunately is also used by people with other intentions. For any dating app, the user must be 18 years old. That's the age of consent. There are some apps that are notable for being hookups and romance, like the ones on the slide, but it's important to be aware of the wide variety of dating apps that exist and ensure that they are not used by minors. When it comes to text messages or iMessages, these can be traced in phone records and reviewed by parents or whoever pays the phone bill, and thus we see many minors here in these places. We believe, again, that this is a model that can be implemented across the United States and internationally as well. I'm going to put up a slide in just a second so you can get our contact information and reach out to us to get more information on this program. Again, it is designed to scale up because it is online. And in closing, this is a challenge that we can meet. In the U.S., slavery was legal for 400 years, and in fact, this year we're commemorating the 400th anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade. And we're facing a lot of challenges and issues today that seem insurmountable. But I look back at Frederick Douglass and the example that he set and many abolitionists who, can you imagine, looked at a legal institution where your federal government said it's legal to own you and it's illegal to teach you. And thank goodness he and many others didn't turn away from that, or we would be a very different country, very different world today. So history lives in each of us. It doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that we've heard of, but it lives in each and every one of the students that we interact with, and it lives in each and every one of you. But the future depends on how we carry that forward. We all descend from somebody that made a difference. Somebody that may have fought or died for the rights and freedoms that we enjoy, may have fought and died just so that some of us have the right to even sit in a classroom and get an education. I had a 10-year-old girl say to me one time, she said, "Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree and I found that my great-great-great-great-grandmother, 4 greats, and I thought I had a lot of greats. Grandmother was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write in secret. She ran away and she became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist." And so she looked at me and she was so excited to tell me, so she said, "Do you know what all of this means?" And before I had a chance to respond, she said, "It means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do." And for our young people to know that history is important, we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're headed, and when they're connected to their past. History is not just about informing the past, but it's also about the present and future. And so in closing, history lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that extraordinarily persuasive, enlightening, historical, and absolutely practical presentation. Thank you for your leadership. Before going to Philip, we've been joined by Bill Woolf, who's the Executive Director of Just Ask, and here's a man who got the Presidential Medal for extraordinary efforts to combat trafficking in persons. He has served as a police officer, but quickly realized that it went so far beyond just law enforcement, and has been working in Northern Virginia and elsewhere to make a difference, and we'll go to him third. But I do want to just recognize that we have our U.S., that is, U.S. Ambassador to the OSCE, Ambassador Gilmore, who I've known for a lot of years, and was a former governor and attorney general, and has done a tremendous job. And I just want to thank him for being here. And we also have Senator John Cornyn, other members of the delegation. But Senator Cornyn is the prime author of a major trafficking law that was signed with an emphasis on services and protection. So I want to thank him for that leadership. That bill was stalled, and he made sure it happened. It's his bill, and it's now law. So thank you so very much.
President Serratelli has just arrived.
And we are joined by the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to say a special thank you to Senator Wicker and Congressman Smith for the invitation to be here alongside the U.S. delegation to the OSCE and for hosting this important event and for gathering you here. Thank you so much for being here. It's truly an honor to present to you today. I cannot brag of an incredible heritage line like my former panelists, and it's truly an honor to share this panel with you, sir. And to sit here and get to know you as well and hear about your work, and I really commend you for everything that you are doing. It's such an important work and an organization that you're leading. I myself come from Denmark. I grew up a pretty ordinary guy and didn't become familiar with human trafficking until the age of 23, which was for me a shock. I had gone to school, gone for education in a first world country, was following the news, and still heard nothing about human trafficking being the fastest growing organized crime in the world. When I found out about it, I was actually studying in Australia. I had been there for 3 years at a college, and someone told me about this, who later turned out to be the founder of this organization called A21, and asked me to go to Greece. It's a long story, but I'm going to skip that, to start the first operational office of A21. So at the age of 23, I traveled by myself to a foreign country I'd never been to, and we opened our first office anywhere in the world of A21, and started our first shelter and got to collaborate with law enforcement and with the police there, and and opened our first shelter within a couple of months. And that's really where everything got very personal for me. I had read the statistics, I had heard the news reports, I had even visited other work around the world at that point. But we invited our very first survivor into our aftercare. And when I learned about her story of growing up in an Eastern European country, of growing up in abuse and poverty, and she looked at me with great fear when she saw me the first time, and I later understood that every single male she had encountered in her life had abused her or been abusive to women, and since I was not abusing women, she could not define me as a man. And so that's when it got real for me. I later learned that our lives had lived in this parallel world. She was born in the same month as me, in the same year as me, and I had grown up in Denmark in this lovely family, great environment, had been loved and had opportunity. She had grown up in this horrible abuse, and at the age of 19, we both dreamed about getting away from our countries. I moved to Australia to study, and she saved up all the money she had to move to Greece to find a better life, to find a job. And unfortunately, she was trafficked into sex trafficking in Greece between 11 different brothels. In her own words, said that she had to service, she set herself up to 100 men a day. If that was just half, I can't even fathom that. Even a fourth, even a fifth, even anything. Meanwhile, I was studying in Australia. I was having some of the best time of my life. And I went straight to Greece, and there we met at this bus station after she had been on a bus for 9 hours, after having been rescued by the police and who were to help her. And I realized that I had done very, very little to deserve the life that I'd had. I'd done very little, if anything, to deserve it. I've been given this life, this freedom, and I realized that freedom and this human trafficking really only have one thing in common, that they are undeserved. She had done nothing to deserve the life that she had had. And so the question I had to ask myself is, what will I use my freedom for? And I know that very clearly today. It is to fight for everyone who doesn't have it. And that's why I'm sitting here today, and that's why I'm with this organization. Human trafficking has well established as one of the fastest growing organized crime in the world. It's real, yet it's hidden in plain sight. And it's really tearing at the social fabric of every aspect of every country around the world. We know that no community, no school, no social economic group, no student demographic is immune to this issue. But we as leaders in this room have an opportunity to propel education as the key to prevent this horrible injustice and equip students with the knowledge to identify the signs. I want to just commend you today for focusing on education and on educating schools to recognize and respond to signs of sex and labor trafficking. With you, I really believe we can lead an effective school-based education programs and safeguard our children. It is hard to believe that in the year 2019, we're still gathering around this issue of human trafficking, of abuse, of slavery, modern-day slavery, that we're still talking about this. I am sure that our great-great-great-grandfathers hoped that that would not be the case. And somehow it still is, and it seems to be larger and affecting more people than ever before in history. And so truly, I'm hopeful that this generation will truly see an end to it. Human trafficking, as I see it, is really a crime of contradictions. We have millions of people who are today enslaved, yet so few are rescued and found freedom from it. We read of billions of dollars, $150 billion in profits on human trafficking, yet see a very small response to this financially around the world. It is illegal, yet we see very few convictions. These statistics are from Europe, out of the UN. It's unseen, yet it exists everywhere, and traffickers are seeing high profits and have a very low risk in getting involved. And until that dynamic changes, I fear that this will continue. We need to turn this awareness into action, and we know that the education system can be essential for bringing that prevention. One of the ways that we as an organization are doing this is through a campaign called Can You See Me? It's a public awareness campaign that is especially disseminated through public transportation systems around the world. It is active in 6 countries now. And the ultimate purpose is to identify more victims and arresting more traffickers. I want to just show a quick video of one of the videos of Can You See Me as an example that is also included in the education material that we produce as an organization. So let's roll this little video. A21 stands for Abolishing Slavery in the 21st Century, and it's a non-profit global anti-human trafficking organization that today is based in 14 locations across 12 countries around the world, including 6 countries here in Europe. A21 focuses on awareness, prevention, identification of victims, as well as survivor aftercare. We are fueled by a radical hope that human trafficking can be stopped and that victims can find freedom. We're passionate to empower people everywhere to make a difference, and we are really seeing a movement of this. One of our events every year is the Walk for Freedom, which has been running for the last 5 years, and this year, just last year, we saw this walk happening across 450 cities on the same day across 50 countries around the world. Probably a city near you somewhere. And I really encourage you, if you can, to support this and be part of this in your community and in the country that you're in. We're passionate about this, and we really believe that young people are the solution to this, and we're just seeing them being incredibly passionate about making a difference, recognizing that they can be the new abolitionists of the 21st century. We're creating long-term sustainable and effective strategies in preventing human trafficking through education. We have a few goals with this, is to prevent human trafficking and safeguarding our children, protecting students by equipping educators and students to recognize the methods traffickers use, offer pathways of engagement so that students can take action and be part of the solution. Because we know that when students are educated, they are empowered. The strategy of A21 has its foundation in the 4 Ps, as we're very familiar with, but we have termed them ourselves as reach, rescue, and restore. The reach aspect of what we do is reducing vulnerability through prevention, awareness, and education. You know, we believe that the formalized school system provides the greatest opportunity to reach and influence this generation. And it is essential that we bring this important topic that's affecting our youth into our schools and equipping them with the tools to identify the signs. The last 7 years, A21 has created educational resources. The 2 main ones are called Bodies Are Not Commodities curriculum, and then a brand new human trafficking awareness program. Bodies Are Not Commodities is a research-based educational curriculum that has been implemented over the last 5 years in 42 states around the US. We currently have a 3-year professional development plan for a Texas schools district reaching 162,000 students, and have been working within 7 states in Mexico since 2014. We are currently working to align this curriculum in South Africa, which will reach over 2 million students. Secondly, this human trafficking awareness program is our newest resource that is available now for students aged 12 and up. It's designed to both be an academic and community group option, small and large. It includes facilitator guides, online and non-media versions, interactive activities, appendix handouts, and videos. And is already available in 13 different versions, 8 languages, including English, Spanish, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Greek, Norwegian, and Dutch. The awareness program can support your efforts to educate, empower, and equip the community and schools in your country. Educators are on the front lines, and informing them and arming them with, and their students with the necessary knowledge and resources is important. I want to just quickly give you a brief overview of this resource that is available. It has 3 basic sessions. In session 1, we get a clear definition of modern-day slavery and begin to recognize the common scenarios of human trafficking and how victims are used as commodities. It includes Universal Declaration of Human Rights, human trafficking definitions, and the latest statistics on the subject. In the second session, we identify how human traffickers prey on our young people and on the victims' vulnerabilities, and how these vulnerabilities can cause victims to be susceptible to human trafficking schemes. There's an interactive activity called the ripple effect, which highlights how students can actually make the difference and create waves through spreading awareness. And finally, in session 3, we are learning about the physical, behavioral, emotional, and situational indicators to identify human trafficking victims. I'm going to finish with this slide, and I just want to say that as an organization, we understand that the only way that we can see a real change through this is all of us playing our part, including everyone in this room. And working together in partnership is really the only thing that's going to make the bigger difference. And I just want to tell you that we are absolutely committed to that. We want to help as much as we can to resource you in whatever aspect that might look like as an organization, with resources, with tools to bring this into schools. And you can of course find more about us on our website or contacting us. So thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so very much for that great presentation. And the fact that you are up and running in so many school districts, I think is testimony to the efficacy of what you're doing, and the need is out there. And again, we have presenters who have, very, very well-defined curriculum, and I do hope you avail yourself. We can make it all available to you, and they can as well. But now I'd like to go to our third and final speaker, Bill Woolf.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is certainly a pleasure and an honor to be here on this panel, joined by my colleagues up here who, only a short time ago I would have never imagined being on this panel. But I wanted to start with a story, and that is a story of a police officer. And this goes back about 12 years ago. And this police officer was assigned to investigations. In particular, was looking into a gang-related case, a criminal street gang-related case. And the investigator had cultivated an informant, had inserted the informant into the gang, and asked that informant to find out how the gang was funneling its illegal activities and what were those crimes. Well, one day the informant called the detective and said, listen, they want me to drive these girls around that are engaged in, quote, prostitution. Is that okay? And that detective, a trained law enforcement officer, somebody charged with serving and protecting the community, responded, sure, go ahead. It's just prostitution. And I share that story with you because it shows that sometimes those that we expect to be trained and respond the proper way don't necessarily know what it is they're looking at. That informant called the detective one night and said, listen, this girl that they have me driving around tonight, she looks really young and I'm very uncomfortable driving her around. So the investigator did his due diligence. He went out, he interdicted the situation and found that it was a 16-year-old girl. Not knowing what that situation was, not knowing what to do with it, took that scenario, took that evidence to the prosecutor's office and presented it. And the prosecutor looked at the investigator and said, I think you have a great human trafficking case. And the investigator, with over 8 years of experience at this point, said, what the heck is human trafficking? And that investigator was me. I didn't know what human trafficking was 12 years ago. I had no idea that it existed. And looking back on my career as a law enforcement professional, the 8 years prior to that, I'm ashamed at how many victims I came in contact with during the course of my duties and never identified them. Since that time, since realizing what human trafficking was and having the distinct honor and privilege of working with well over 200 victims of human trafficking during the course of my career, I have shifted gears and I have made it my personal and professional mission to eradicate human trafficking. You see, so many individuals that are out there don't know what it is that they're looking at. And if a professional like me, with over 8 years of investigative experience in one of the more highly trained police departments in the United States, I was also a task force officer with the Federal Bureau of Investigation at the time, and I didn't know what I was looking at. How can we expect a 14, 15, or 16-year-old to understand what's happening to them? If I didn't have the words, the vocabulary, the language to be able to explain what was being described to me as a crime, how do we expect teenagers and even younger elementary-age kids to understand what it is that's happening and to be able to express it in a way that they're going to be able to get a response? And this is really something that drives our mission. It drives what we do because so often I heard from the victims that I recovered during my time in law enforcement, I just didn't know what was happening. That's unacceptable to me. We have to step up and we have to provide that education to the young people so that they're at least afforded the opportunity to protect themselves. After I learned of that case, I started to look into this issue of human trafficking and really discover the prevalence in the United States and abroad, to see how much it really impacted our communities in particular. And it was from that we funded a regional human trafficking task force that was a multidisciplinary task force made up of law enforcement, social workers, victim services professionals. And within that task force was born the Just Ask Trafficking Prevention Foundation. The goal originally was outreach and awareness. However, we quickly learned as we sat around the table and we brainstormed, how do we attack this problem? How do we address it? Fortunately, in the United States, we had great leaders like Congressman Smith, who had put federal laws on the books to give us the tools and resources to address it. But at the time, I was a police officer in the state of Virginia, and at this point, Virginia had no laws to address this particular issue. And so we were struggling. We were struggling with resources and how do we address the problem? And so we sat around and we really started to brainstorm this, and we brought in survivors and we're talking to them. And we said, what could we be doing better? And over again, we heard education, education, education. Tell us what could possibly happen to us. Educate us about what the threats are, and then when you educate us about those threats, tell us how to protect ourselves. And I think that is a fair request on behalf of our children, that we give them that opportunity. So in 2013, we founded the Just Ask Prevention Project. Our mission is to inoculate communities against the threat or the disease of human trafficking, a public health crisis. We know, we recognize this is a crisis that we are facing, a global crisis, because it is expanding at an exponential rate. It is quickly catching up to the drug trade, and yet the victims are becoming younger and younger. These are our children. These are our children. So we envision a world where children are free to achieve their full potential without the threat of being trafficked or exploited. And we can give them that opportunity through education. We were founded in 2013 with an initial focus on providing awareness and education. We very quickly adopted a multi-vector approach, focusing on peer-to-peer education, bystander empowerment. One of the things that's important as I lead this team in the development of programs, particularly prevention programming, is that we instill a sense of hope. It's one of the reasons why our colors are bright colors, our welcoming colors, our attractive colors. It's one of the reasons why a lot of our messaging is centered around hope. Because we know that victims that get trapped in this lifestyle, this cycle of exploitation and violence, oftentimes one of the largest factors that keeps them stuck in that situation is hopelessness and helplessness. Who do I turn to? Who's going to understand? And you can imagine if, as a police officer, I didn't know what was happening. These young people know. These young people know. One of our, we have a parent coalition, which is I'm simplifying this and not doing it justice, but it's a support group in providing resources for families of victims of trafficking. And the woman that leads, the director of that parent coalition, her daughter was trafficked starting at the age of 14. Now, her daughter went to school officials 22 times and reported that she was being trafficked. Now, she didn't use the words trafficked because she didn't have those words in her vocabulary at the time. But all 22 times, as she struggled to express the victimization that was happening to her, as she struggled to seek help and get out of that exploitive situation, she was told by professional school administrators 22 times, "We don't believe you." Education is so important, because without it, we are leaving these individuals stuck in this lifestyle of exploitation. Since our founding in 2013, we're a fairly new organization. We've educated over 1,000 professional and community-based organizations internationally in the identification, prevention, and response to human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. I'll talk in a minute about our curriculum, but one of the core values that we have at Just Ask is a three-pronged approach to any program that we develop. And I call it the EPI approach: education, prevention, and education. You see, it's not just enough to educate. We have to give them real tools that they can use to prevent. Now, I'm talking about our children, but I'm also talking about professionals that we train and engage with, giving them the tools to implement proactive prevention measures within their environment. And then intervention. Because while our goal is to stop trafficking from happening, we know that at this point, we're not going to be able to stop all trafficking. So what we have to do is we have to make sure that any program, anything that we give to our young people and to our communities includes a component that helps them seek help and know how to get out of that situation if they happen to find themselves in a bad situation. And it's really important that we give all three components. Oftentimes, my team will hear me say, awareness is not enough. We've got to go beyond awareness, and we need to make sure that the programs that we're implementing have that added component. Our motto is safeguarding communities through partnership. We believe in partnering with governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, school districts, anyone that we can engage with that is on the front lines of combating trafficking. We seek to build that capacity of these organizations. We seek to create self-sustaining programs so that it is not a burden on that institution or organization, so that we can make sure that we can spread the scope and reach. Partnering with great organizations like A21, the Frederick Douglass Society, making sure that those programs, we can augment those, because there's plenty of work to go around. For those of us that are in the field know, there is definitely plenty of work to go around. So it's all about joining forces and using you all as the leaders within your governments, your countries, and within your communities to be able to carry this message forward and to say this is a priority. We need to put this on the forefront. We need to explore what is going to work, and we need to do that now. Because you don't know when the next child will be victimized, right? We know that through working in the field, our team has compiled practical knowledge which has consistently shown that primary vulnerability or deficiency leading to teens and young adults being manipulated into trafficking is a lack of knowledge and awareness. We talk a lot about at-risk youth. We talk about what are those socioeconomic factors that lead to children being at risk. We talk about those that don't have strong support systems, and all of those are very relevant and need to be addressed. But the primary vulnerability is a lack of understanding and knowledge. As I mentioned before, so many of these victims that I've had the honor to work with and to rescue out of these situations said, I just didn't know. I just didn't know. And we need to create a situation where that is no longer an option, where they no longer have to say, I just didn't know, because they were properly trained and educated in how to recognize and respond to it. In the United States, we have an organization, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which does amazing work. And the National Center estimates that 1 in 5 children will be approached at some point during their adolescent years by a trafficker. Imagine that, 1 in 5. I'm a father of 6. That means, statistically, at least one of my children will be approached by a human trafficker. That's scary. That is scary. And I want to make sure that they have the skills, tools, and resources that they need to respond when that happens. There is no reason why we need to take a step back and say, well, will it happen? Maybe it'll happen if it happens. We need to prepare for when it happens. Human trafficking has become the second largest criminal enterprise, targeting younger and younger children. Kids are taught how to protect themselves from drugs. Why not traffickers? It only makes sense. It only makes sense that we engage in this fight. These are some statistics specific to the United States, but more than 90% of trafficked youth still attend school at the start. My colleague from A21 mentioned that the schools, the school districts, and the school systems are rightly positioned to educate young people and implement prevention programming, and I could not agree more with that statement. They spend, on average, more time with children, with adolescents, than parents do oftentimes. So use that opportunity. Use that opportunity to educate them. The Department of Justice in the United States reports that 50% of sex trafficking victims are under the age of 18. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported recently an 846% increase in reporting. Unacceptable. It's unacceptable. We've got to get out there and implement prevention. The U.S. Department of Education has recommended developing comprehensive prevention awareness as the United States continues to look at what can we be doing better. And we've noticed this shift in focus. Again, I'm so thankful for the leadership of Congressman Smith and all that he has done, and now bringing into light this conversation about prevention. Because when I made the decision 2 years ago to leave the police department, to lead this organization full time, it was because prevention is at the core. We can go out and we can recover victims all day long, and that's important work and necessary work. But unless we get in front of the problem, we will never reduce the number of victims. They will continue, the traffickers will continue to change their methods, they'll continue to avert law enforcement, and they will continue to exploit young people one after another. Traffickers, and I've had the pleasure of arresting many traffickers and putting them in jail for very long periods of time. But many of them would tell me during the interviews, they would simply say, why would I sell drugs? I can only sell that drug one time. I can sell kids over and over and over again. And if one gets taken away, if one gets interdicted by parents or sent to a rehabilitative situation, I can go get another one at the snap of a finger. That's how easy it is to manipulate them. Why? Because we're not implementing strong prevention programs. We've developed lessons based on best practices for curriculum development. Very proud of my team. We recently were called the gold standard in prevention curriculum. We currently reach 160,000 youth annually in 3 countries, and currently preparing to implement in Africa, in specifically Nigeria this fall. We have a very community-focused and culturally relevant approach. We recognize that it really is not a one-size-fits-all model. Communities across countries and even within countries vary. And so it really is going back to that partnership. It's why it's necessary for governments, non-governmental organizations, along with organizations like ours that are up here that are developing the curriculum, to work together to make sure that we adapt that to be culturally and linguistically appropriate for the communities in which we are implementing. Our curriculum specifically is designed by professional curriculum developers. We have a team of technical experts that works full-time on this. Ours are based on actual case examples, so we bring relevant stories to the table. They also incorporate other subject areas. It was very interesting. A couple of years ago, we decided to impanel a teen advisory council. And this was a group of teen leaders across the country that came together to review our materials, our approach, our messaging. And I have to say it was probably one of the more humbling experiences in my life to have a room of 15 and 16-year-olds tell me what I'm doing wrong. But it was very insightful, and it has really led to developing that curriculum in a more effective manner. And one of the things that they harped on us is that you have to tie it to areas of relevancy for us. Talk to us about online safety and how that might lead to human trafficking. Talk to us about healthy relationships or dating violence and how that might lead to human trafficking. And so that's exactly what we've done and developed our program around that. And as I mentioned, everything that we do is based around education, prevention, and intervention. The resonating themes: positive self-esteem, respect, choice, consent, hope, and community responsibility. It's about protecting ourselves and our peers and neighbors, right? The results consistently show an increased knowledge of human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. Young people that go through this programming have demonstrated skills in prevention of human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. They possess the ability to identify resources for help and intervention, and we start to see that so important cultural shift in understanding the systemic causes of human trafficking. We are creating the next generation. When I go out and I lecture, particularly in my spare time, whatever that is, I teach at a university in the US, and I tell the people in my class, I say, you all are the ones that are going to make real change with regards to human trafficking. We are just scraping the tip of the iceberg right now in our understanding. And so it really is about paving the way and having that cultural shift for real change in the future. We've also seen increased reporting through self-reporting and also peer reporting. Many people ask, where does the name Just Ask come from? What are you saying, just ask, right? What does that mean? Well, back when I was working cases, I recovered a young lady, Emily, out of a hotel. Emily was 17 years old at the time. And as I was interviewing Emily, I asked her, I said, tell me a bit about how you got involved in this. And she said, well, I've been involved since I was 14 years old. I said, well, tell me a little bit more about that. How is it that you were involved for 3 years? And she said, well, she started to describe how she got involved with it through a boyfriend. Things progressed. Her grades started to drop off at school. The school counselor got involved. Truancy officers got involved at the school. Later on, she got involved with the juvenile justice system, had a probation officer, went to counseling for anger management, later substance abuse counseling, school administrators, both parents in the home, all of these professionals. And I was dumbfounded. I probably had a drop jaw as she's telling me all of this. And I said, Emily, how is it possible that for 3 years you were surrounded by professionals that are trained to identify when things are not right, and nobody ever identified you as a victim of trafficking? And she looked me dead in the eye. She said, Detective Woolf, nobody ever asked me. If somebody would have just asked me, I would have told them. But nobody took the time. Nobody took the time. They were too busy pointing their finger at me saying, I need to get my grades up. I need to improve my attitude and my behavior. Nobody ever asked, and I did not feel comfortable talking about it. So in honor of Emily, we named the organization Just Ask, with the goal and the desire to make sure that everyone within our communities are empowered to just ask. I thank you all certainly for your time. I hope that we can explore the possibility of partnership, working with you to help build capacity and implement strong prevention programming within your communities. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that tremendous presentation. 3 unbelievable speakers, above all, leaders in this field. I want to thank them for that leadership. We do have some time for questions if you have them. We have Ambassador Evans, our ambassador to Luxembourg. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here. Mr. Evans? A question? Where? Can you give this question to the please?
Thank you so much. Over Ukraine. As you might know, Ukraine is one of the countries which is unfortunately heavily impacted by human trafficking. I'm certainly a big fan of education, and I appreciated your very informative session. However, today I will be asking a question to my peers, legislators. As a legislator, I have to mention that the nature of human trafficking is very often international. In my country, people sell themselves most probably to some corporations, brothels, and people of high stature in Europe. And with all, with all the powers that I have, it is very hard for me to prosecute those who benefit from human trafficking. I looked at your act, Frederick Douglass Act, and I was surprised to see that one section, particular sections 124, which is called Actions Against Significant Traffickers in Persons. You, for some reason, and maybe I'm not correct in understanding your idea, but you limited sanctions possible under Magnitsky Act only to representatives of governments. I know that many corporations benefit. By the way, in Ukraine, human trafficking is not only about women, and the recent trend is it's becoming about men. They enslaved, they working in construction, agriculture, and there is no punishment to European corporations. So my question to all of you, gentlemen, would you be willing to expose this business? This is business as usual in Europe right now. And include more specific sanctions, not only to government representatives, who are often have privilege of diplomatic immunity, and those sanctions are very hard to impose given international relationship between different governments, but maybe include corporations and physical persons which are not with diplomatic immunity.
I'll start, and I'll be brief. I've written 5 laws, including the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and Frederick Douglass was the most recent. In our first reauthorization of the TPVA in 2003, we added a whole section that holds any corporation to account that does business with the United States government. If they are complicit in any way with trafficking, one, we will hold their people criminally liable. Secondly, we'll take away the contract. And the Department of Defense, Department of State, and the U.S. government in general is one of the largest procurer of products and services in the world. And they have to sign, they being the CFO and or CEO, when there's a contract. They agreed to all of this, so they're being informed that we will watch very closely. There have been audits done by the U.S. government, including inspectors general and what we call the General Accountability Office, in terms of implementation to make sure that we are holding these corporations to account. So there is a zero tolerance policy, and I'm glad you brought it up, with corporations. Doesn't mean that they don't cheat, doesn't mean that they don't engage in those kinds of things. We've also done it in the 2005 reauthorization, put language in with regards to peacekeepers and organizations, UNICEF, the peacekeepers under the UN flag or the UN auspices, because we found in places like DR Congo, it was the peacekeepers that were raping little girls and going on, rather than being a protection force, they were an exploitation force, not all, but many of their adherents. We keep trying to find better ways to improve, recalibrate. That's why the message today and the incredible inspiration from Kenneth Morris with the Frederick Douglass Foundation was to say, we're missing something on prevention. And what we're missing is that we prevent, we do good videos, we do things like that, but we're not getting into the schools and empowering. And all 3 of these leaders have come up with tremendous curriculum. In your country, right before the Russians invaded, we had a seminar, I helped put it together, it was my idea, with the foreign minister, to train up your flight attendants and others so that if they see something on a flight to Dubai or wherever they might be going with Ukrainian women, they'll tell the pilot, and when they land, there will be a separation to try to ascertain whether or not it's a trafficking in progress. Many flight attendants were at that meeting. It was in your capital, but those things have to be ongoing. But that's why we're talking here. Magnitsky does and should apply to any bad player when it comes to this. We focus on governments because of their complicity at the police officer level. Justices, judges, and the like is often very, very profound and could make all the difference. But we do hold corporations to account. Thank you for your question. Over here.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Congressman. My name is Vladimir Georgiev. I'm a member of parliament from Macedonia, head of the Macedonian delegation. Compliments to you, Congressman, and your associates for doing this. I'm glad to see that here between Senator Corey and Governor Gilmore all the way to Senator Wicker, there is between 100 and 150 years of political experience altogether combined. Also, there is a law enforcement work, NGO work, history, generations, and all that. I have a question. It's a very, very concrete about my country. In the last couple of months, there are organizations and parliamentarians that are mentioning that we should legalize prostitution in the country. What's your take? How legalization of prostitution impacts the human trafficking? Because sometimes when they're advocating for that, they're saying it's going to decrease it, but also there are different voices. So what's your opinion? And on that issue, one more. What's your take when you see generally the United States between different states and counties? How the possible legalization of prostitution impacts the local communities. My personal opinion is that we should not walk that avenue, that we should address that so far. But as I said, in the recent months and years, there are organizations and parliamentarians that are articulating that. And finally, mainly to the person from the NGO from Denmark, Macedonia is a similar country like Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Albania, the countries in the region. This issue is not too much on the horizon. Yes, we're seeing it, we're reading for it. For instance, in the last, we were making a progress in addressing the human trafficking, but in the last 2 years we're backsliding in general, and that was stated by the US State Department. How should we address this issue early on, since we're not in such a bad position as other countries, but we can see that there is a gathering storm and it's coming more and more? Thank you.
With regard to the legalization of prostitution, I am not for that. In our experience, in our work, we're talking about children being sold for sex and for labor. And if we were to legalize prostitution, there's always going to be on the periphery people that are looking to buy children. And so that's something that I don't think is a good idea.
So I'll just echo those comments, and I can give a law enforcement perspective on that. And it's my belief that the legalization of prostitution would make it easier for the traffickers to carry out their business. We know that this is a crime that's hidden in plain sight. The traffickers are able to do so, and if we were to legalize prostitution, then essentially you have the traffickers able to control these women, and you blur the lines even more with regards to what is prostitution versus what is sex trafficking. So.
Great, and thank you for the question. I think, gentlemen, like Congressman Smith has been an absolutely pioneer in this area for so many years, even before I even was aware, who knows what I was doing at that time. Which is incredible, and I think there's been different waves of this, and especially in the last 10 years, there's been a huge push on this issue, and it's interesting even to see my own country, Denmark, taking a step down the ladder in the TIP report this year, in the latest edition here, stepping down to a tier 2 and along Germany. I think this is something we have to keep alive. It's not a trend or a cool thing to talk about, and then we're gonna make some quick laws and we've solved it all. This is gonna be a consistency, a sustainability to this over the course of the long haul. And that's exactly why we are advocating today on getting it into our schools, believing that this is gonna be relevant when our kids grow up. This is something that we're gonna have to address, and we have to get into at as early an age as absolutely possible. And I would not fall into the trap of comparing my country to someone else, but take responsibility for what's going on in my country. And rather say, oh, we're doing okay, and saying, how can I actually be a leader in this? How can we as a country be a leader in the fight against human trafficking? And not say, oh, we're doing all right compared to our neighbor. No, how could we lead our neighbor? Because that's how the change is going to happen, is that we are, that's what I love about the TIP report as well. It's just a nudge, it's a push, it's an incredible motivator to just target status quo. Hey, we gotta keep this alive, we gotta keep it relevant. This is something that's worth fighting for, and let's keep it top of the agenda. Yes.
Thank you.
Ambassador Gilmore?
Well, I'll just add a question, and maybe even speculate as to the answer. You said that the problem is that people just don't ask. My mind immediately said, well, why is it that they don't tell? Why is that? The burden, you shifted the burden to the law enforcement people, to the social worker, to the parent. There's nothing wrong with that. But, where's the responsibility of the young person to tell someone? And I think, I'm going to offer my own answer, I think. And I think it goes to the question that knowledge is not the answer. Just asking and just telling is not the answer. It's in fact addressing the vulnerability. They don't tell because they're vulnerable. And even if they did tell, they're still vulnerable. And the problem, of course, is how many people in the world today, how many young people in the world today are vulnerable. And each of those is potentially subject to human trafficking, but not because of the lack of knowledge or the lack of information or the lack of reporting, but instead because the victim is vulnerable. How in the world do you address that?
I get a question a lot, and because of my unique connection to history, I always like to look back at history, and people have asked me, why don't they tell? Why don't they say something? And I look at Frederick Douglass as an example. He was enslaved for 20 years because he was enslaved in the mind. Once the shackles were broken, once he was beaten into submission by his overseer, he didn't think for himself. He didn't think about freedom. And so we can agree that Frederick Douglass was a brilliant person, a brilliant man. It took him 20 years to have the courage to run away. While he was in Baltimore, he was free to move about that city, to work on the ship docks as a ship caulker, and he faithfully brought his money back to his master every single day. So if we can look at that in history, how shackles of the mind can control somebody, then we can also look today and know through, as we've talked about, force, fraud, and coercion, that young people are enslaved in the mind, and they don't know. They don't know what their situation is or how to get out of it, or who they can trust. And so I think that, again, looking at history and Frederick Douglass being a great example of somebody that was enslaved in the mind and didn't need those shackles to keep him in Baltimore.
Add briefly to that. I agree wholeheartedly that it is an enslavement of the mind, and the vulnerabilities that exist among those that are being trafficked. There's no set list of vulnerabilities. There's nothing that we could go and say, okay, well, we could just remove this vulnerability from this population or that vulnerability, because the traffickers will mold their approach based on who it is they're going after. And different traffickers have different preferences on what their vulnerabilities are. Some prefer, single mothers. Some prefer children that come from single-parent homes. Some prefer prior victims of sex abuse. I mean, there's so many different vulnerabilities that are out there. And I do think that it is, in fact, that we aren't asking, and it goes to the point of the enslavement in the mind, because culturally speaking, the way that society portrays a lot of this is still that it's prostitution, right? And so oftentimes the victims are labeled as offenders by societal standards. And we've got to shift that. We've got to change the culture around the issue. And that applies to both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, right? Because the labor trafficking victims oftentimes
we hear people say, well, can't they just walk away from that situation? Or can't they go get another job? Or why can't they speak up? It's because that mental manipulation and coercion, and oftentimes I think we forget how powerful that is. So prevention education and just asking some of these questions really does empower youth and young adults that are being victimized to get out of that, or at least disclose at that point, because they feel like the disclosure is going to be well received.
My name is Diana Johnson. I'm a member of the UK delegation. I just wanted to congratulate you on what you've described today around the education of young people. But I wondered if there was an issue about the wider education of the public. And this issue about hidden in plain sight and nobody asking, surely there's a responsibility on us all as members of the public that when we see things, and in the UK there's been a lot of attention given to car washes, where there's lots of people hand washing cars, or nail bars, particularly Vietnamese, I think it's women who are in these nail bars. People are starting to say, well, actually we're going to ask, we're going to sort of find out what's going on here. Are these people actually trafficked or enslaved? So I think, I just wanted to know, is there more of a public education programme that you have, as well as focusing on young people?
If I can answer that, for us, that's an absolute yes. We have a campaign active in your country. Can you see me? The video that I showed was an American scenario, but we have similar 5 or 6 video scenarios from the UK specifically, covering exactly what you mentioned: car wash, the nail bars, taxis, public transportation, forced labor happening even on street level. And these are in Heathrow Airport. These are in the 8 biggest airports in the UK, along with bus stations and other public transportation platforms. I really hope you get to see that on one of your travels. We are very much for that. The wider public, we are involved in a huge campaign called, another huge campaign, one of the founding partners of It's a Penalty, which is around sporting events as well. We have in the US as well. We are one of the partners of Strike Out Slavery, which is in the baseball. We have It's a Penalty involved in the Super Bowl and in the Olympics and so on. And having, for example, World Cup in Brazil, we partnered with international airlines that actually had videos screening to all passengers flying to Brazil, giving them at face value, stuck in their seat, having to watch these videos on their way to events. And so I think there's many creative ways that we can take to educate the public. One thing I will say though, in context of today, is that it is very hard to move the adult mind. But if we can reach young people in schools, I think we have a much better chance at changing the future than sometimes changing public opinion. I think that's why it's so crucial that my fellow panelists are focused on schools and are in schools and all the way down. I mean, we are all the way down to primary age in some of our curriculum and programs in some countries. So I think that is really vital, and that's the importance of today.
And if I can just piggyback off of that, and of course public awareness is very important, but it's been our experience in the work that we've done at the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives over the past 13 years that even when the public acknowledges that this is a problem, a lot of times they want to bury their heads in the sand. Remember the quote that I mentioned, Frederick Douglass, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So imagine educating students and having millions of students, tens of millions of students around the world going into their communities empowered to educate their parents, their peers, and the greater community. This is, again, a long-term solution. I think we want always, to see change happen right now. It feels good to rescue somebody, and we should continue that. We need more resources for the rescue, rehabilitation, and restoration. But we have to also think long-term and have a bigger picture of how we can address this. And education and having students continue their educational career, and then go on to careers where they may start their own nonprofits. They've got this issue in their passion, in their soul now, become attorneys that fight for human rights, use their passion, their talent, their intellect, and creativity to address this. So long term, this is going to be a solution that's going to work.
I think we're pretty much out of time, but I want to thank all of you for participating, particularly our three tremendous leaders. I would just note, on the Just Ask, just a little comment on it. There was a study done by Senator John Cornyn, actually did a law, the Abolish Human Slavery Act, Human Trafficking Act of 2017. It was found through 2 studies at least that on average a woman who's been trafficked, sex trafficked, she'll go to a doctor, will be brought to the emergency room 59% of the time. One of the studies found that they would go to other clinics, and nobody would ask why she's there, who that guy is out in the waiting room, waiting to retrieve his property that is exploiting. So Senator Cornyn put a provision on one of his bills that became law that trains in the United States, our health professionals to recognize human trafficking. And that is having a tremendous impact. What we're doing now, we're trying to build on the great work that these 3 men have done, say we need to replicate the idea of teaching the teachers and then empowering the children to recognize what's going on, and that alone will have mitigating impact, we think, on trafficking. And empowered youth, as Ken keeps saying, we don't want broken children. It will become obviously broken adults. So again, I want to thank you for this tremendous presentation. We will try to get this included in the ministerial for the OSCE itself. In the past, resolutions that we've passed in the Parliamentary Assembly have been adopted by the OSCE itself, and that would be a hope. We will make available this recording. It'll be on my website. I hope it'll be on our friends here. We'll try to get it on the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's website if you want to review any of it. And of course, they all have websites, and we will provide emails if you'd like it to further be in contact. But you don't have to completely reinvent the wheel. You've got the wheel right here that has been very well honed and is having a tremendous impact on stopping this modern day slavery. Thank you, and God bless you.